Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, guys, if you've been watching the news, there's a lot of tension right now with India and Pakistan. Now, that's not necessarily a new thing. There's been tension for decades, but things seem to really have been ramped up recently. And of course, this gets world headlines because they're also nuclear powers. So with that being said, I wanted to see some of the coverage going on right now. And I thought we would look at one of the familiar faces that I cover on this channel, and that's Simon Whistler on his Warfronts channel. And his video is just called India and Pakistan Are on the Brink of War. Now, the timing of this is actually lining up with my lessons right now in class. In about a week and a half, I'm going to be talking about the modern history of India and Pakistan, specifically after World War II with the partition and basically their, rundown of their histories since partition. And I'm always able to bring up a lot of these struggles that they had starting with the partition and to today. But it seems like, again, in about a week and a half, this is still going to be a very tense situation that hopefully I can make those connections with my students. Now, I know a lot of the deeper context, but the more immediate one for right now is something I'm a little ignorant on at the time. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit and, of course, share what you know down below. Okay, this original video is linked down below. Please support that. And let's check this out. All right, I'm going to try to interject with any context that I can. We'll see how deep in history he is going to go with the conflict between the countries. But again, I'm really hoping for some more immediate stuff because that I am a little bit more learning about.
Right now, two nuclear-armed nations stand at the precipice of an all-out war.
That's
Following
Simon.
a shocking terror attack against Hindu tourists in the disputed region of Kashmir, the bitter South Asian rivals, India and Pakistan, have leapt at each other's throats, exchanging fire, cutting off a critical water supply, and moving military assets in a way that suggests large-scale violence may be imminent.
That is one thing I'm hearing about right now that's become a potential catastrophe is water. Water being such an important resource for the region there. Simon sounds different. Am I crazy? He sounds way different. But anyway, I assume with any immediate cause, and you're going to hear with any long-term cause, Kashmir is going to be a major issue. Immediately from the partition of India, going back to 1947, that was a debated and heavily contested region that's in the northern border between Pakistan and India. When they did the partition, that was something they couldn't get a clear-cut really consensus on because they had different backgrounds. It's a very diverse region as well. And both sides kind of claiming the territory. And they kind of just went along with the partition regardless of it. And it's kind of been, again, this in this tug of war, push-pull thing, again, since the 1940s.
India appears to be building a pretext to strike Pakistan directly. Pakistan is making clear that it will defend itself at any cost, and attempts by the entire rest of the world to bring a stop to the crisis have failed.
So attack on the Hindi population there. So Pakistan and India were not divided countries until after World War II with the partition. All of that was colonized and basically ruled by the British. And the big fear, just going back in history, was as follows. That region, and going back to, how many centuries we want to go back here? We can go back to Mughal Empire, Delhi Sultanate stuff, when Islamic governance was the status quo for centuries in India, even though it was a predominantly Hindu population. Mughal Empire, Delhi Sultanate before them were Islamic rulers that had come in and ruled. And there's a deep history. We don't have time to go into all of that. But when partition was starting to be talked about, one of the things that Muslim Indians were fearful of is that without the British there, that their rights would be kind of trampled on as the minority in the region there. And they supported, especially Indian Muslims, supported the creation of basically an home for Indian Muslims, which does end up being what happens with the creation of Pakistan. There was a West and East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. But that's a little bit of the earlier kind of context going before that about why aren't India and Pakistan divided today when it wasn't like that before.
Fragile peace between India and Pakistan. The entire rest of the world
front-loaded the video for you a little bit.
Failed. The fragile peace between India and Pakistan, it is crumbling as we speak. So here's what we all are going to need to know in advance of whatever comes next.
Good. How far back are we going to go? Are we doing the immediate incident?
Now,
so some kind of like a terrorist attack. Again, I just heard some things in passing, but I know very little about the immediate thing that's happened.
Before we begin, we've got to issue a key caveat here. Everything that we discuss in today's episode is up to date as of sunrise, Monday, the 28th of April in New Delhi and Islamabad. Anything that's happened since that time will not be accounted for in this episode, and in this case, that is especially important to bear in mind.
There's going to be stuff unfolding every day. So even when I put this out, which will probably be deciding on when I want to put this out, either be Wednesday, April 30th or Thursday, May 1st, right? So a lot could have even happened since then.
Look, judging by the pace of escalation on both sides going on right now, it's not safe to assume that this conflict will remain in a phase of preparation and build up for any length of time. So do rest assured that if war has already broken out by the time you see this, then we already have an update coming. Now, the current crisis in India and Pakistan began about a week ago on the 22nd of April in a meadow called the Whistler Valley, a few kilometers away from the resort town of Pahalgam. Now, that town is located in the Himalayan mountains in a region known as Jammu and Kashmir that's been the focus of a dispute between India and Pakistan for nearly a century.
That's the region. It had different leaders, both like Muslim and Hindu, and had different loyalties. And they ended up, it was so complicated from what I understood about what they ended up doing with Kashmir with the split. It was like you'd have these different autonomous sort of regions. It was a mess.
For the sake of time, we'll leave an explanation on the history of this conflict for another episode, but suffice it to say that for now, while India and Pakistan have agreed to split the region along a mutually accepted line of control, it's remained the site of both ongoing insurgencies and political rivalry between the two nations.
To even show the history of these different cultures occupying similar spaces, it also is not a surprise where you saw like Sikhism develop not far from this region, which has elements of Islam and of Hinduism, and that was kind of that whole region, kind of their epicenter, very near that, up in that border, because of centuries and centuries of Muslim and Hindu occupation of the same region. You get syncretic belief systems like that.
Is in the Indian-controlled part of Kashmir, and despite the conflict in the region, Pahalgam itself has been a safe, popular tourist destination.
Beautiful area, and rivers and mountains.
Typically kept well away from tourist areas. But on April the 22nd,
I heard there was
the tranquility of Pahalgam was shattered when 5 armed gunmen attacked a large group of tourists in the nearby Whistler Valley. Wielding assault rifles and wearing military-style fatigues, the gunmen snuck through the sparse local security and began to interrogate the tourists they encountered. Muslims were separated out. First, if they could recite a verse of Islamic prayer, and then they asked the other men to show whether they were circumcised. A common practice in the Muslim world. Hindu men who...
There's usually something that goes behind that. Like, why were they doing that at that time? What was this interrogation, whatever? What was that in response to? There's always a domino effect when you see these type of actions.
Did not pass the 2 tests, were then executed at close range, while women and children present at the scene were spared.
They were trying
26 people were executed in the attack.
Root out who's Muslim and who's not.
A Christian and a local Muslim man who had tried to intervene. 20 others were wounded, and the insurgents escaped.
What was the stats again?
Muslim man who had tried to intervene.
We're dead? Okay, so we're dead.
Including 24
Hindus, a Christian, and a local Muslim man. So he said the Muslim man was trying to break it up. Yeah, I mean, this is going to enrage people.
Hindus, a Christian,
when you see it so targeted
to intervene
with certain identities.
Were wounded, and the insurgents escaped, at least for a while. Credit for the attack was claimed publicly by a group called the Resistance Front, or TRF, a recently established organization that first became active in 2019. They're an offshoot, a subsidiary by some accounts, and a splinter group by others from a well-established Pakistan-based jihadist insurgent group called Lashkar-e-Taiba. This is an organization with a long history of attacks on India, including the days-long siege of the city of Mumbai in 2008, when over 160 people were killed and Westerners were hunted down.
And the motive, they're saying, terrorist organizations, they are often created in and often are established within the context of something going on. That's often what happens, some kind of response. And is this just about Kashmir? And they were saying, they were tied to attacks in Mumbai, which is nowhere near that, with the Kashmir thing. I wonder, again, some more of the context. What was going on in 2019 that created this group as well. This is where us, like, as people that try to interpret the news through history, which everyone should do, and no people don't do enough, you can answer a lot of questions, and a lot of them are questions people aren't asking, which again, people often, don't want to get to the root of things and draw those and draw back further and further. They want to look everything at the surface at the right now. And it's important to draw things back as far as possible. Where are the roots of these things, right?
Like the resistance front, Lashkar-e-Taiba's primary objective is to break India's control over Kashmir, thus allowing it to be annexed by Pakistan.
Sure.
The resistance front is somewhat less overtly religious in its messaging and is prominent on social media for recruiting purposes, but in terms of its overall goals, it and Lashkar-e-Taiba are on fundamentally the same page. Now,
so some questions I would have too is, what is their role with any kind of connection with the Pakistani government as a whole? Are these guys easily condemned? Are they enemies of the general Pakistani government? Is this group, did they come into power because they don't think the Pakistani government is doing enough to try to take control of Kashmir? Where does their funding come from? Who are they connected to? Are they connected loosely with people in the government or the military, that kind of thing?
Critically,
all the questions, these are the type of questions we should ask if you want to detangle these things and get to any kind of source of problems.
India accuses Pakistan of direct.
Okay, so we got Modi.
Fundamentally the same page. Now, critically, India accuses Pakistan of directly supporting the groups, fomenting attacks, granting them safe harbor, and benefiting from their violent work to advance Pakistan's long-held objectives.
Now, it's important to notice too, where like Al Qaeda, remember they were operating in Pakistan. They had, bounced around with Afghanistan, Pakistan. Remember that's where the U.S. military found Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. So this area, India is gonna probably use as context for Pakistan harboring some of these groups. Okay.
Now, from the moment that news of the Pahalgam massacre began to spread across the globe, it was clear that the geopolitical implications could be major. As if to confirm those suspicions, India immediately accused Pakistan of being behind the attack, citing digital evidence and intelligence intercepts that implicated Pakistani operatives in a supporting role. India is yet to produce conclusive evidence for the world to see, but that did not stop a first round of reprisal measures against Pakistan from coming within just a day's time. India announced 5 retaliatory steps in total, including the closure of the primary border crossing that links India and Pakistan, the expulsion of Pakistani diplomats, a travel ban on all Pakistani nationals to India, and an order for Pakistani visa holders to leave India immediately. India formally...
Wow, okay, so no Pakistanis at all can come into the country, going to block all of them. Anyone that's in there, a national, is going to have to be gone. Now, we'll see how you can enforce that, because I got to assume there's insane amounts of Pakistani civilians in India. There's such connections with those countries, but I don't know for sure. By the way, how many people live in Kashmir right now? I'm going to look this up. All right, a quick just Google question. Population of the region historically known as Kashmir is estimated to be around 15 million people. This includes approximately 10 million in Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir and 4.5 million in Pakistani-administered Kashmir. Additionally, there are about 1.8 million in Gilgit-Baltistan, an autonomous territory created by Pakistan. So again, this shows a little bit more about the how they administer this region. And again, it's broken up so much within that. So you have this larger region, but then it is, splintered out. And this has kind of been how it's gone again since the 40s. And it's been a tense situation for many years off and on. Sometimes it gets better. Sometimes it does get bad. Not the first time I've heard about this being so potentially deadly as well. I remember in junior high, it would have been in the late 1990s. Any of the old people like myself, anybody remember Channel 1 News? In where I lived, every classroom had a TV installed into the room, and every single morning, this program called Channel 1 News would come on. It was news designed specifically for like junior high or high school age kids. And I remember it would have been like 8th or 9th grade in the late 90s there. that it was really tense. And it was also around the time Pakistan got nuclear weapons. And I remember that being such a big thing that people were like, could this cause a nuclear war? Because both countries had it. They're one of the small or few countries that actually have that. And I remember that being a thing. And I've constantly remembered that ever since, again, I was like 14 years old. All right, back to the video.
Downgraded its ties with Pakistan and issued information on 3 suspects, 2 of whom it claims to be Pakistani. Now, the most important retaliatory measure, by far, was the suspension of a critical agreement called the Indus Waters Treaty, a compact first signed in 1960 to establish control and sharing arrangements over the waters of the Indus River and several other important rivers.
Hopefully you've heard of the Indus River. You probably heard about the Indus River, I'm hoping, when you took a world history class. You probably learned about it in the first, 2 weeks of your course, because one of the oldest civilizations, it goes through Pakistan, was in the Indus Valley, and it's the blood vein of Pakistan today.
Up until now,
that's critical. I mean, if they don't have that kind of access, I mean, you're talking about water access for millions of people. This is a huge deal. It often gets tied up when you're talking about access to water resources, starts getting into international laws about warfare and what is seen as acceptable or not. And usually this type of thing gets a lot of criticism.
Now, the treaty has never been suspended despite multiple violent conflicts, and it's been hailed as one of the most successful water sharing arrangements worldwide. Importantly, the water of the Indus River and other governed water sources flows from India into Pakistan, giving India practical leverage over the rivers if it ever chooses to take action. Pakistan has long regarded the potential suspension of the treaty as a major national security threat, both because India could withhold water from Pakistan and cause crippling droughts, and because it could release the water in massive floods traveling downstream.
Yeah. These type of water rights issues and in conflict zones have been such a big deal. It especially happens in the Middle East. Like the Tigris and Euphrates, lifeblood of the Middle East. Those go through a bunch of countries. Headwaters are going to be around in Turkey, and then you're going to have all through the Mesopotamian countries. So into Iraq or Syria, and they all use that. And so many have like dams and things up the river that it affects everybody obviously below that. And these countries have been at war, and it's been always such a conflict of what if you were to do that. Or say like an Israel and Palestine situation where so much of the water can be accessed, like from the Palestinian water access can be accessed and is accessed through like Israeli control. And you've probably heard about that talked about in the conflict right now about historically how Palestine has had water issues at that within that relationship with Israel.
Percent of farms in Pakistan in massive floods traveling downstream. 80% of farms in Pakistan
you could flood it or drought.
Waters governed by the treaty, and the nation has already suffered consecutive years of drought, meaning that a long-term cutoff of water could be crippling for Pakistan in the long term. So for India to suspend the treaty in the wake of the Pahalgam attack sent two
it's a huge piece of leverage
signals all at once.
For India.
First, indicated that India's assessment of the terror attack must have either showed conclusively that Pakistan was responsible, or to take a cynical view here, it had decided to use the attack as pretext for a major escalation.
Is this going to be like a Serbia, Black Hand, Austria, Hungary type of thing? It's like, how many people are complicit in it within the rulers and the ruling elites in Pakistan? You have some kind of rogue people that might be sort of connected directly or indirectly, but then you already have a hostile situation, say like you had with Austria and Serbia on the brink of World War I, and things like this and events like this, acts of terror ignite ingredients that already exist, and in a lot of ways has been almost wanted, to try to handle these conflicts and try to address these conflicts. Countries being ready for war already. We've seen it over and over again.
And second, given the magnitude of the threshold that India just crossed, India most likely wants to make it clear that it will not be backing down. Pakistan issued its own series of retaliations in short order, closing its airspace to Indian airlines and giving a sharp condemnation of India's decision to suspend the water treaty. The nation suspended a very special visa category granted to Indians, with the exception of Sikh pilgrims, and suspended all trade with India, including trade deals and goods exchanged through third nations.
You have these Sikhs, or almost like third parties there, which are in the millions up in that region. It's where they kind of started, who have always been caught in the crosshairs of all of this.
Pakistan suspended its own historic treaty, the similar agreement signed in 1962, which establishes principles governing the carefully managed peace between the two nations, including a ceasefire in Kashmir. Pakistan accused India of, quote here, fomenting terrorism inside Pakistan, and stated it would consider all bilateral agreements and treaties with India to be suspended until India ended its alleged sponsorship of terrorism.
What has been the official state response to those attacks? How largely are they like condemning them? That's something I have not heard him talk about, or I haven't looked into yet.
Perhaps most important of all, going back to the Indus Waters Treaty, Pakistan vowed to consider any attempt to stop or divert water allotted for Pakistan as an act of war, one that would draw full military retaliation from Pakistan. Then, the provocation started. Overnight on the 24th, troops of both nations exchanged fire overnight across the mutually agreed line of control, particularly in an area called the Lipa Valley.
What this kind of thing often happens, it starts with like warning shots and stuff, but did they connect much?
The shooting continued on the next night.
Was this part of it?
Next, with
they actually blew up
soldiers
some
using
stuff?
small arms to fire into each other's vicinity in a growing number of locations. By the night of the 26th, Pakistan had deployed self-propelled artillery, and the skirmishers shown no signs of stopping. The Indian aircraft carrier INS Vikrant was dispatched to the Arabian Sea, while its latest guided missile destroyer, the Surat,
Aircraft carriers are so
live-fire
cool.
missile interception and shot down a sea-skimming target in a signal of India's military readiness. Ongoing exercises by the Indian Air Force have intensified, and military assets have begun moving rapidly across the country. In India, in Pakistan, and among the diaspora of both nationalities worldwide, protests began around diplomatic locations, with protesters supporting each nation clashing abroad at times.
This is one of those things, Britain. Britain is like, yo, we got out of here for this reason, and we were hoping the partition would just keep everybody happy, but they're like, don't come to us anymore. But you can't just be an empire that built these scenarios and then just try to wipe your hands clean and be like, nope, has nothing to do with this anymore. I mean, you are forever tied to your colonies when you are an empire. I mean, so many Pakistanis and Indians live in Britain because of that history and all the migration that's happened. That's what they deal with. There's so many that live. You go to London, so many Indians. I mean, they're like they have that as their like their mayor. Isn't he like of an Indian background as well? And prime minister. So they've had that history before. But yeah, this is the stuff where it's like Britain, you're still reaping all of these effects of your imperial era.
Meanwhile, in India-controlled Kashmir, Indian security forces cracked down on suspected terrorists with skirmishes.
They use AKs, huh?
That have left several soldiers and several
AKs?
militants dead so far. In the process, security forces destroyed the homes of people suspected of being involved with the attack. Finally,
Is this one of those things? Again, you hear this a lot. You saw it in retaliation for the attacks in Israel, where you have, the bombing of these places and retaliatory things, usually saying, they are targeting, terrorists, and becomes hard. I know a lot where people want to see like very, very clear evidence of that. And then, of course, civilians are always in the way of this, which is always so sad. But it's one of those things that you'll see these attacks, but it brings in usually more conflict, because they'll be like, well, how good was your proof that these people were actually directly responsible for those attacks? And what measures did you take to limit civilian casualties? And then you get in this big dilemma going back and forth, this like moral high ground ping pong that goes on.
forces destroyed the homes of people suspected of being involved with the attack. Finally, India demonstrated that it was willing to meddle with the rivers governed by the Indus Waters Treaty. Although India cannot immediately cut off the flow of water because it's only allowed by treaty to build installations that can't dam those rivers,
treaties are just paper, though.
Water that it can store on a river called the Jhelum. According to the Times of India, water was released from a dam without notice after heavy rain, sending floodwaters downstream to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Residents were able to evacuate, and Pakistan appears not to have interpreted that.
So are they saying that this was not part of the conflict? It was just extra rainwater, but then at the same time, it kind of doubles as like as a threat from India?
Threat as the act of war that it warned against, but it may only be a glimpse of what's to come.
They were warned through announcements.
Monsoon season is coming, and Pakistan would be powerless to stop a rush of surplus water into the nation unannounced. India could divert water to its own canals in just a matter of months, choking off the supply to Pakistan in the short term, while large-scale dams could take anywhere from a couple of years to the better part of a decade to finish. India has indicated that it will not share flood warnings with Pakistan in the future, and it will withhold any information from Pakistan that would indicate how much water is coming downstream or when it'll arrive.
Interesting. You know, something I wanted to look at real quick is the comparison of the militaries of these countries. Let's look it up real fast. India has significantly larger military than Pakistan. India's active military personnel number around 1.46 million, with an additional 1.15 million in reserve, compared to Pakistan's 654,000 active soldiers. India's paramilitary forces outnumber Pakistanis with 2.5 million personnel compared to Pakistan's 500,000. So they have almost 3 times as much. That's significant. Now, the other thing that is always going to tie this stuff is allies. India famously was and has basically been in the non-aligned movement, where back in the Cold War, they didn't side directly with either the United States or the Soviet Union, although they had that like agreement of friendship kind of with the Soviet Union. There's a lot of pressure when India got its independence that the Soviets and Americans wanted them. They were going to be a massive country with all kinds of resources and all kinds of strategic use, but did not side. Now, Pakistan, interestingly, the United States and Pakistan did have kind of like a loose alliance for a long time. It's obviously not very healthy right now, especially once the war on terror started. And then you saw we already talked about like Al-Qaeda and operating and going into Pakistan and stuff like that. But yeah, for a long time, the United States and Pakistan had a relationship. I can't imagine that the Americans would be doing that. I mean, we already seen how controversial it is for a lot of Americans, how much the U.S. has helped support like a Ukraine, which there's deeper ties with, and a lot more of the U.S. having been at the table of those conflicts and the agreements as part of that, way more than ever than with Pakistan. So I can't imagine that would be very wanted by Americans.
Now, at the time of writing, India and Pakistan have not entered a large-scale conflict, but according to most expert observers in the region, a harsh retaliation by India seems to be an inevitability. In fact, reporting by the New York Times suggests that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is working overtime to explain its justifications for a strike on Pakistan to the international community.
Well, see, Modi just met with Trump just a few weeks ago. You know, they could be tight and offer, I don't know, supports in some vocal fashion, but with any other military support. But you also saw with the Indian military being superior to Pakistan, if it's just one-on-one, India may not need help. So
per the Times, Modi has received and spoken with over 100 representatives of other nations, and according to diplomatic sources, he's working to secure either approval or at least a tacit agreement not to get in the way from the officials that he's meeting with. Publicly,
the UN, what will happen with the UN? I don't think either of those countries are on the UN Security Council. I just went over that with my students not long ago who is currently on it. I'm trying to remember if they are specifically. Are we going to hear any meetings in the UN about this?
Modi has vowed severe retaliation and threatened to destroy areas that militants in Kashmir rely on for safe haven. Modi's harsh response has been well received domestically, with much of India outraged over the deliberate targeting of Hindu civilians in the terror attack in Pahalgam. For years, Modi's political movement has drawn on the power of Hindu nationalism in the world's most populous nation, and now anti-Muslim sentiment in India is rising rapidly.
Yeah. Hindu nationalism has been a huge thing now. We see it. It's a huge thing online. I see a lot of Indian nationalists. They'll come into the Discord community and be in the comment sections and a lot of that stuff. And it's a huge movement right now, essentially to make India more Hindu in that sense. And some have said that maybe they go to the extreme of it. They will talk about history definitely in a way that I found to be controversial in a lot of senses, especially with some of the deeper history that has gone on India with different migrations, different ruling groups, and a lot of that stuff. But yeah, anti-Islamic sentiment has been at an all-time high. It's also why you will usually see people in Indian nationalists, be very vocal about supporting Israel in the Israel and Hamas and Palestinian situation going on right now. And a lot of it with a shared animosity towards Muslims. So you can see those connections there.
Abroad, few nations have the type of meaningful leverage over Modi that could prevent India's leader from escalating if he so chooses, and those nations that could put a stop to what's happening don't appear inclined to do that. As for what comes next, past action may help to predict future conflict. India and Pakistan have fought several wars since the partition of India in 1947 with varying results. Their first war, fought over Kashmir in 1947 and 1948, ended with a stalemate that's sometimes interpreted as a partial victory for India establishing the line of control in Kashmir that still governs affairs to this day. In 1965, India got the better of a 6-week-long war, while in 1971, India was able to beat back an initial Pakistani assault and force the surrender of over 90,000 Pakistani troops. In a more limited engagement, the Kargil War of 1999...
Okay, this is probably the one then that I was aware of that I was talking about, again, when I wasn't Mr. Terry then, it was just little Terry.
90,000 Pakistani
I didn't know
troops.
that conflict had a
name. In a more
name.
limited engagement, the Kargil War of 1999, Pakistan provoked a war that was quickly drawn down due to international pressure in yet another defeat for the Pakistani military.
And again, that was really huge because Pakistan had just recently had nuclear weapons. So that really caught the eye of the world. And basically, the world powers were like, hey, you guys, knock it off. And they were like, all right, backed away, thankfully.
Other engagements since that time have consisted of smaller skirmishes before a rather hurried return to the status quo. The good news to take away from that quick history...
You know what Kashmir almost kind of reminds me of? Is almost like Cold War era Berlin. Because you'll see both sides try to put on their best faces on those very, very tight and close borders. You will see them do military exercises and like troop movements. And again, just try to show this great face at an area where you are so close to each other in an already contested area. Is it weird to call it like a Cold War Berlin kind of situation?
These two nuclear-armed nations have proven adept at avoiding a nuclear exchange so far. Pakistan gained the ability to detonate a nuclear weapon around 1984. India tested its first weapon a decade earlier. And today, each side possesses an arsenal at or above 170 warheads.
Jeez.
Neither side has yet launched a nuclear weapon in anger. And for now, the current conflict doesn't seem to be on track for a nuclear exchange.
Yeah.
So that's something to count on at a moment where good news in this crisis is pretty hard to come by.
Yeah,
but both in terms of their nuclear and their conventional weapons, the most important factor that may differentiate this conflict from prior exchanges for India and Pakistan is the degree to which their respective militaries have evolved. Pakistan has acquired hundreds of modern main battle tanks, quite a bit of heavy artillery, and advanced Chinese fighter aircraft since the turn of the 21st century.
That's what I was about to ask about. The United States not going to be supporting Pakistan. That relationship's done. But wondering where you get it. If it's not going to be the U.S., then it's going to be China. So
India, meanwhile, is rapidly...
India and China have had their issues too in land claims around the Himalayas, around like Tibet and things like that. So I guess that would make sense that China would also... They're not going to be doing, that kind of business with India.
Its military over the last turn of the 21st century. India, meanwhile, has rapidly modernized its military over the last several years, fielding an aircraft carrier, new top-of-the-line combat jets, and a small but significant number of other advanced pieces of military hardware, along with a high volume of older weapons and vehicles. Notably, both sides have enhanced their delivery mechanisms for nuclear weapons, meaning that if either side does choose to escalate toward a nuclear exchange, then each side will need to treat the other's capabilities with immense care in order to avoid provoking a first strike.
Hope so.
Again, it is not likely that a nuclear exchange will happen over the course of this conflict, but we are talking about a direct confrontation between two nuclear-armed nations. An exchange simply cannot be ruled out completely.
You got to pay attention to it. You got to pay attention to it if you're the rest of the world. Now, again, what will be the foreign pressure? Is it going to be like the same thing where just everyone's like, hey, you two, knock it off? Escalation and de-escalation.
As for what happens next, that choice appears to be in India's hands for now. The nation has largely ignored calls by other countries and international organizations, including the UN, to de-escalate, and Modi's preparations over the last few days would indicate that he and his inner circle do intend to begin at least a limited exchange. But how far India will go, nobody except Modi himself knows. Critically, India does have a precedent for responding to attacks like these. In 2016, an attack killed 19 Indian soldiers, and in retaliation, India launched targeted airstrikes on militant targets on the Pakistani side of the Kashmir line of control. In 2019, at least 40 Indian paramilitaries were killed, and again, India's response came by way of airstrikes, although on that occasion, Indian and Pakistani pilots got into a dogfight over the region. Although a wider war was averted in both instances, and that is a reason for limited optimism, the precedent also makes it difficult for India not to launch airstrikes, this time as a bare minimum. Both the targeting of civilians this time around and the scale and scope of India's response.
Hey, real quick, I've seen this pop up in my feeds on the different socials I've had, where it's like, somebody accidentally caught on video the attack or whatever, the terrorist attack, and it's like a dude about the zip line. I haven't watched it, but I swear I've seen it pop up so many times. Is that legit? Is that something I should look at? Because I've seen that posted. And if you know what I'm talking about, let me know down in the comments if that's a legit thing.
Far suggest that this time around, and the scale and scope of India's response thus far suggest that the response will be considerably larger. Among the non-nuclear options available to India, if the nation is interested in a resolution that does not start a full-scale war, is the possibility of a covert operation inside Pakistan or Pakistani Kashmir. Those could target known militant bases or other concentrations of Lashkar-e-Taiba fighters or assets, or it could target the Pakistani military or its intelligence services, depending on the message that India wants to send and the intended severity of that message when it arrives. Alternately, India could engage in cross-border shelling, targeting either uninhabited areas for purely symbolic purposes or targets associated to either non-state militants or the military.
Dude, look at that truck.
Finally, it could engage in wider airstrikes, either with aircraft or cruise missiles, but counterweight a higher volume of strikes or the selection of higher-powered munitions by targeting irrelevant or minimally important locations. Or India can launch an attack that will lead to wider conflict, demonstrating its willingness to challenge Pakistan directly, and then leaving it up to Pakistan to either back down or retaliate in kind. The problem with even limited strikes, however, is that they can very easily be misinterpreted or received by Pakistan in a way that India doesn't anticipate. Depending on what India does and how Pakistan reacts, there's no telling whether even a carefully calibrated symbolic attack could lead to a much larger exchange.
Yeah.
Indeed, there's no telling Pakistan will even wait for India to act.
Common tactics with this kind of stuff to escalate without escalating again. You got your warning shots, okay, and if you do attack something being an uninhabited area, that usually then evolves into kind of what you've seen maybe with very targeted attacks, trying to back it up with those are people that are responsible with that, and you try to, usually what you see with this stuff is try to gain leverage at the time where you want to negotiate. And that can be problematic because both sides of any conflict want to be in the higher handed position when you do that, because you have to, if you have the higher hand, you usually don't have to concede as much. And that can become problematic because at some point, is somebody going to be willing to go and make a deal if you do seemingly have the lower hand? And that can be difficult to do. And you just hope that that can happen here.
First, with India seeming to be on the warpath, Pakistan may choose to act first and gain an advantage if the nation's leaders believe that a more significant conflict is in store.
Tough to do a preemptive attack almost.
That we've seen play out within just the last year between Israel and Iran.
There's a lot of parallels, interestingly.
To send a specific message, but there are no guarantees that the message will be received as intended.
That is an interesting comparison, though, that doesn't exist necessarily, as they do both have Pakistan and you have sizable militaries, but you don't have anything like the Iron Dome that India or that Israel has, and as nearly as much power over the other that Israel has over Palestine.
But there are no guarantees that the message will be received as intended. There is, however, room for de-escalation on both sides. Pakistan has the option to institute its own crackdowns in Kashmir, identifying and prosecuting militants or potentially even cooperating with India in its investigations.
This is where it sounds a lot like post-Gavrila Princip assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's like, remember, Austria demanded to be able to go into Serbia and conduct investigations, and also to have Serbia hand over, people that they suspect of being a part of the terrorist plot. And, with that one, that was interesting because Serbia ended up giving into a lot of those demands in the famous ultimatum, but it still wasn't enough to avoid war. So hopefully we don't get that in this situation, because that led to World War I. We'll see what happens. There has to be, at least to appease it, probably the Indians, is going to have to be a full cooperation of, and we'll see how harsh the demands were. The demands were quite harsh that Austria had of Serbia, and Serbia would have to give in a lot of their autonomy in this situation, dealing with the aftermath of that of that attack. So will Pakistan agree to that? I don't know about that. But either way, India is going to want to see some kind of retribution and some kind of involvement of Pakistan to the perpetrators.
To be clear, that's not likely to happen, but it is an option. Pakistan can appeal to either the United States or China to help mediate the situation, or it can decline to strike back in the event that India attacks, although that decision would come with political costs back home. India could opt for a long-term retaliation.
We'll see who becomes a third-party arbiter of the situation.
Manipulate the waters
there
of the
probably will be
Kashmir
one.
region, build dams over the next few years, and pressure Pakistan that way. Or it could even make limited moves in pursuit of that course before letting the crisis calm down naturally with time and making a graceful exit from this cycle of escalation. Unfortunately, the more likely scenario is that de-escalation talk is wishful thinking. If the reports on India's diplomatic efforts are accurate, then the nation may strike Pakistan within days, it may strike within hours, or by the time you're watching this, that strike might already happened. All indicators are that India intends
as far as I'm aware,
with grave seriousness, and its decision to take retaliatory steps that New Delhi has stayed away from for decades would suggest that this time is different. How bad it gets, how Pakistan reacts, and how many lives are ultimately lost, we're only going to find out with time. Thank you for watching.
Final thoughts. All right, so I'm covering this right in the midst of the kind of early part of this conflict, whether it becomes a bigger conflict or not. So a lot can happen. News is coming in very quickly. Often what you will find in these scenarios, especially if you're looking at the Pakistani or Indian news of the situation, is being very quick to report things that have not necessarily been vetted for their information. You see this with the beginning of every conflict. You saw it with, even most recently with Russia, Ukraine, and as well as Israel, Palestine, and so much of the immediate news gets out and gets run with before it can really be vetted. And you find out there's all kinds of misinformation that happens especially in the early stages. So that becomes interesting and something that has to be vetted through in this situation. So again, we'll see what happens. I think I talked, hopefully able to add a whole bunch of perspective, because again, so many things came to my mind going back to British Empire years, and then the initial partition in 1947, about how dramatic that was and deadly that was, and how those lasting issues over Kashmir can date back to that. But then also find the parallels, say, with World War I with Austria and Serbia, and then with Israel, Palestine. It's amazing how many parallels we can find in war and see actual precedent for these type of actions as we look to detangle these problems, see them for what can happen with a cause and effect, and compare and contrast relationship in news. And hopefully, again, you look at all news from a historical perspective, because that often lacks with current event analysis. All right, we'll see what goes on with this, and we'll see you next time.